Man, it's everything it looks. G'day and welcome to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups. On this episode, we're working back on the 1275 A+ engine. We're going to start reassembling the bottom end. I'm going to show you how to do it. Alright, so on today's episode we're going to be installing the crankshaft because it is not secured in there whatsoever. We're going to be installing some thrust washers in there. I'm going to explain what they are. We're going to put the main caps on. We're going to install the oil pump, which is going to go on this side of the engine, along with the new camshaft and the followers. Okay, so the first thing we want to be doing is getting the thrust washers, which are going to be these right here. So the thrust washer prevents the crankshaft from moving laterally, so meaning forward and back. Being a manual car, every time you put your foot on the clutch, physically you are trying to push the crankshaft out of the engine. So to counteract any movement that's going to come from the clutch or movement that's going to come from the reciprocating motion of the engine, which means up and down, side to side, it is going to get limited by these washers. So these washers go between the crankshaft and the block. Now, as the crankshaft wears inside the block, the tolerances are going to get larger. So you need to get the right size thickness shims to go between the crank and the block. So in this case, we're going to be using standard thickness shims. Now the shims look something like this. There are two with tabs on them and then two without tabs on them. So we need to pull the crankshaft out and have a look. Now when you're storing a crankshaft, make sure you store it one of two ways. The first one is inside the block. So for instance, if you are taking it out to get machined, take it out straight down to the machine shop, get it machined, linished, whatever they're going to do to it, bring it back, put it straight back in the block. The second option you have is to take it out of the block like this, get yourself a rope, tie it around the top here, and then hang it up so it is hanging vertically. The reason for this is the crankshaft is weighted in different areas on the ends here and here all the way across. If you are just to lay this down on a flat bench over time, whether it be a week, a month, a year, whatever the time frame may be, maybe longer, maybe shorter, you can distort the crank. You may even create harmonics due to a warped crankshaft. So store it one of two ways, either inside the block or hanging up by a piece of rope. Okay, so these are the main caps that we got back from the machine shop. They didn't tell me which order they come in, but I'm sure we can work it out fairly quickly. So one of them looks like this. As you can see, it has a notch cut out here and here. So this is probably going to be the center line one. And also these are going to go in the middle here. So they're going to line up quite easily. As for the other ones, they are chamfered on different edges. So the back edges are completely straight, whereas the front, it has a lip. So we just need to work out which side this goes to and then which side this one goes to. Now I can give you a bit of a clue. If you remember when we took it apart, going back to the episode when I stripped it, at the front of the engine where the timing cover is, it had two bolts at the bottom of the timing cover. This is where these two go. So I know this one goes towards the front of the engine. So that leaves this one to go towards the back. So one is going to face the back of the engine, which will be this one here. One will face the middle, which is this one here. And then one will face the front of the engine. Now I have just noticed on each of the caps, they have been marked. So the guy that pulled them apart actually marked them for us. At the front, it will have a couple of dots designated down there. So he's gotten a punch and he's marked exactly where they need to go. He's also marked the block as well. So all we need to do is line these up. So it's just made our job significantly easier rather than trying to figure out which way it goes. If you're ever unsure, once again, consult your owner's manual before reassembling. Now that we've determined which of the bearing caps goes where, we can now start to install our main bearings. So there are two different types of bearings we have. We have a main bearing and we have a big end bearing. The main bearing secures the crankshaft to the block, whereas the big end bearing secures the conrod to the crankshaft. So we're going to open up both of them and then we're going to figure out what exactly we need and which one is which. Now they are two different sizes, so if you're ever unsure and it doesn't fit, chances are that's probably not the right one. Now, given that there are also two different sizes in terms of the boxes, we probably determined that this one's going to be the mains and this one's going to be the big ends. So I'm pretty much spot on, I reckon, with this. Now with this engine in particular, they have two different types of bearings. There's ones with the locating tab on the outside here, on the outside of the bearing, and then it also has a locating tab on the middle of the bearing. So we need to determine as well which bearing goes where. Okay, so upon closer inspection, you can actually see that the bearing shell is going to sit here. So these ones are recessed off to the left-hand side. So we're going to be using this type. And then on the top of the caps, if you have a look and flip one over, it's going to sit directly in the middle. So we know that the ones in the center are going to go on the top of the caps. So all we want to be doing is getting a light film of oil or assembly lubricant to go on here and then installing it inside the bearing cap itself. Okay, so in my case, I'm just getting some of the Penrith 20W60 and I'm just going to pour a little bit into this container. That way we can just use that as our assembly lubricant. As I said, you can buy specific assembly lubes, but engine oil would do just as fine. So we're just going to get a little bit on our finger. We're going to grab the bearing itself and just apply a thin film on the inside as well as on the outside as well. Once it's lubricated, we're then going to come over and we're going to install it into the housing. Now, as you can see, this hole needs to line up with the center of it. Once the cap goes on and the crankshaft's in, it'll push it exactly into center, but make sure that this hole isn't obstructed by anything else. Once you've done one, make sure you follow the same process for all the others. Okay, so once they're lubricated, before we install it, we want to be getting the other shims that we have. So these are going to go on the middle part just down here. So what you can do just to prevent them moving is just apply a thin film of oil to the back of them to get them to hold if they're not going to sit there by themselves. Now a lot of cars are different in the way that they place their thrust washers. Some of them are spread all the way along the crankshaft, some of them are spread just in one area itself. So in our case, it's only in the center of the crankshaft that it has these thrust washers. Once you've done the bottom part, you're then going to install the crankshaft. Be very careful to make sure that none of the bearings move. If they do, you can just push them down by hand. You're going to grab the main middle bearing cap along with the two thrust washers on the side. So one either side here, making sure that they line up with the brass side facing outwards. Then that's just going to sit directly on top of the crankshaft like that. Once it's in place, you can then go and tighten it up by hand. Make sure that you never ever use a rattle gun on these main bearings or even conrod caps. Okay, so the next thing is, because we have put the main caps on, it's time to tighten the 6 bolts. So once again, we're going to go back to our torque wrench setting and we're going to go down to where it says the main bearing set screws. So some of the early model Cooper S's along with the late model Cooper S's came out with nuts. This in our case has bolts, which they use the terminology screws, which is actually incorrect. So the tightening torque that we're going to do is 60 pound-feet. We're going to grab our new torque wrench and we're going to set it to where we need it to be. On one side is newton meters and on the other side is pound-feet. Alright, so now that it's set, we can then go and tighten it up. Now the method that I like to use is to double check to make sure that the bolts are tightened up. So most people will just click it once and then leave it. Sometimes you find if the socket isn't seated on the bolt properly, or even the nut, or it's on a bit of an angle, sometimes it can give you an incorrect torque. So what I like to do is put it on and then give it a click, go once, then twice. And we're going to repeat that same process for each one of the 6 bolts. Now with a click type torque wrench like this, it is important to make sure that when you're finished, you unwind it. So inside the torque wrench is a spring, and over time that spring can wear. So if you leave it torqued up the entire time on a standard torque wrench like this, it can actually stretch the spring and therefore put the torque wrench out of calibration. If it's an electronic one, it doesn't matter. But when you're finished, always good practice to wind it off until it stops. That way you can guarantee the longevity of your tools. Okay, so here is our new Kent camshaft that we're going to be using. It's got a heap of instructions here as well, so we'll give those a quick read and make sure that we install it correctly. Now, a lot of camshafts you find will have a bedding in process, so it'll mean that when you go to start the engine, when you're running it in, you need to run it at a certain RPM for a certain amount of time to make sure that it wears in correctly. If not, you can do damage to the lobes and they won't wear correctly. Okay, so there is our new Kent camshaft. This is the 266, so you can see the clear difference in the lobes here. They are a lot higher in the ends and a lot smaller down the bottom end of it. So this is going to give us a really good duration and a really good sounding engine. So we're going to set that off to the side for a moment. We're going to get our old buckets to go inside the lifters. We're going to put those in first. Okay, so we just grabbed the last box that we disassembled everything with. This is our old oil pump, which is going to suit the end of the camshaft. So this is the correct drive. You need to make sure that when you are matching up camshafts and oil pumps, if they are driven via the camshaft, you need to ensure that they go all the way home. If it's a different bit, you need to make sure that the camshaft suits it. So we're going to throw that one in the bin, but for now we're going to set it off to the side just so it's out of the way. Now we want to be getting our buckets and loading those in. So what we're going to be doing is leaning the block on its side, and then we're just going to slide each of the followers in. Okay, so now that the block is on its side, we're going to get each of the followers and we're just going to line them up in here. So they'll just sit directly in there, making sure that the open end is facing the top and that the flat end is facing the camshaft. So grab each follower one by one and just install it. So that just lines straight up through here, and then you're just going to feed it in nice and easy, making sure you're not going to push it in if it doesn't want to. Now the good thing about this is you can stick your hands in either side of the block to help guide it. Now on some camshafts you can drive a large bolt inside the end of the camshaft and use that to help guide it in if you're having trouble. So especially on V8s when they're twice the length, if you need to be able to get it right through the block and you're doing it inside the car, sometimes a large bolt can help you obtain it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is just turn the crankshaft around. Now remember that the deck has been machined, so it is completely smooth and flat. So you want to make sure that when you are building something like this, you have it on a flat surface. Either a piece of rubber, cardboard, or even a piece of timber would be fine. So what we're going to install now is the oil pump. So we need to make sure that it is not only clean, but also that we have a new oil pump gasket. So we come over to one I prepared earlier. These are some of the parts that we're going to be using. It will be in the rebuild kit that we have. So we want to be looking for this round sucker just here. Looks something like this, a little bit like Pac-Man, not so much, more so like Swiss cheese. So this will only go on one way. So you want to make sure that you are lining up these holes with these here as well. So if we have it in the wrong spot, it's not going to be directing oil properly into the oil pump itself. So you can see the way that this goes is the reverse of this. So what we're going to do is flip that around and then line it up with there. Now you don't need to apply any sealant to this gasket at all because it is going to be oil fed. You can just apply a little bit of oil around the outside just to hold it in there. So we just grab our new oil pump, which will be in this box. It also has a seal in there along with a new lock tab for the camshaft, and that's our oil pump there. Now, once again, in the box is a set of instructions. It says that you need to prime it with engine oil beforehand, or most cases I generally just prime it with Vaseline or petroleum jelly. Now, the reason for this is petroleum jelly will break down with the engine oil and don't do any damage to the internals of the engine whatsoever. So if we just pull it out, sit off to the side, the first thing we want to do is make sure that it spins freely. That way you can ensure that it is turning freely and we're not going to have any dramas with it. Now, the next thing we're going to be doing is applying a bit of oil inside here. That way we can help prime it. Now, using our Letto's Greek style yogurt, we're just going to apply a little bit in here. So this is the oil that I was using before just to re-grease the new bearings on the crankshaft. So all we're going to do is put it in there and just turn it around. That way it's pushing it all the way through and we have a bit of oil in there to prime it. Just turn it either way. That way it moves all the way through the pump. Okay, so now that we've primed it, we can get the new gasket and we can start refitting it. Now I'm just going to tip a little bit of this oil out. That way it's not going to go absolutely everywhere when we go to put it back in. Alright, so what we want to be doing is lining up this half moon seal here along with this half moon seal on the paper gasket. Now, to help ease it in, we're going to get the original bolts and we're going to slide it through. That way it's going to have a little bit of pressure holding the gasket on there and it's not going to fall out straight away. Okay, so the other bolt is just here. So slide it through. That way it will slightly hold the gasket, making sure that you don't damage it. And we want to be lining up those bolt holes along here. So all we want to do is just line it up to where it needs to be and then start the bolts by hand like always. So I've just worked out that my torque wrench doesn't go that low, but it converts to about 12 Newton meters. So it's not going to be overly tight. Because I am a seasoned mechanic, I do know torque settings quite well. Now, you need to remember that when you are tightening stuff, you need to look at the thickness of the bolt and what sort of grade it is. If it is something like the main cap bolts here or even the conrod bolts, they're going to withstand a lot more torque than what a simple 10mm or in our case a 3/8 bolt would like this. So consult your owner's manual. If you're unsure, get a torque wrench, possibly a 1/4 inch or even a smaller 3/8 torque wrench to tighten up these two bolts. Once they're torqued up, we can then start the reassembly process for the pistons. Right, so the next thing we're going to do is grab our thrust washer that's going to go at the end of the crankshaft. That'll sit directly up in here. This will only go one way. It does have a tapered edge on the inside. As for the end of the crankshaft, it is also slightly tapered. So you want to make sure it goes that way. If it doesn't go that way, it's not going to sit as flush as what it can the correct way. So once it's on there, she's all good. Now we're going to install our new oil pressure relief valve. So I've got a new one of these. The spring is in good condition. In order to check it, all you need to do is measure the length and then confirm it with the specifications in the book, and it will tell you whether it is correct or not. Okay, so we grab our new oil pressure relief valve cup and we're going to slide that in to begin with. So that'll just go directly in here. It will slide all the way to the end. Now we install the spring straight on top, and that spring will obviously compress as it goes in. Now we need to get our cap. Now we do have a new washer that needs to go on there as well. Sometimes when you go to remove an old washer, you can twist it and it will come off. In our case, it's not going to. So all we're going to do is grab ourselves a pair of side cutters and we're just going to cut it off. I generally cut it at the 12 o'clock position and then the 6 o'clock position, enabling it to fall into two halves, and there you have it. So we'll grab the new one now. Alright, so that's the new one there. So that's just going to slide directly on top of here, and you'll find as that goes on, it will just crush it. Now this is what we call a crushed washer, so as we tighten it up, it will physically crush it. So you're just going to slide it on there and then just start tightening it up. Okay, so there's no actual set torque setting for this, so all I'm going to do is turn it until it starts to crush, give it a little bit more, and then that's it. Now inside our little box we have a couple of little items as well. So I'm going to get a new oil pressure switch. This is our distributor drive spindle. This is the old half moon seal that goes on the end of the gearbox, so that can just straight in the bin. And we also have our bracket as well. So while we're here, we're just going to install this and just tighten it up so we don't forget to do it later. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is install the piston rings onto the pistons. Now this is something you want to be super delicate with, only because if you get this wrong and you snap them, you're going to have a world of pain. So you want to do this with as much precision as you possibly can. Before we start though, inside the box, when they test fitted the pistons inside the bores, because it has been bored 40 thou, so you might just be able to see here if I can get the camera to focus. So there we are. So it's been bored 40 thou. When they had to machine it, they needed to take some of these studs out. Now these bolts help locate the gearbox to the block as well as tighten it up. So we've got to make sure that we reinstall those as well down the track. Okay, so we open up the box. Now the cool thing about this is they all come in numbered bags. So there's two of number 4, number 3, a number 2, and a number 1. Each of them tells you exactly where it needs to go. So in our case, we're only going to have 3 ring grooves. So we're going to have the top, the middle, and then the oil scraper down below. So we're going to be using number 1, number 2, and then the number 4s. Number 3, we're going to sit off to the side because we don't need that. And once again, inside the box is a set of instructions. So make sure you read these very carefully before you go and start to install them. If not, seek professional advice and get them to install it for you. So we're just going to open this up using a razor blade. Just be nice and gentle, that way we're not going to destroy it. It is very important that when you install piston rings, you install them the correct way. This one has a very faint dot that you can likely just see on the left hand side here where my finger is. So that's going to be facing upwards. It is imperative that you make sure that this faces the right way. Also, when we install them, we're going to be installing them at different positions on the clock. So if you imagine this line here to be 12 and that to be 6, 3 and 9, we're going to be positioning one at about the 10 o'clock position, another ring at the 2 o'clock position, and then the last ring we're going to be positioning it at the number 6 position. The reason for this is if you have all of the piston rings lined up, you're going to get what we call blow-by. Blow-by is when the pressure from the cylinder escapes past the piston rings all the way down through to the sump. So by offsetting them, you're ensuring that all of the pressure stays within inside the cylinder. So all we're going to be doing is slowly feeding it over the top, nice and gently. So because this is number 1, we're going to do number 2 first because it has to slide past number 1. So we sit that one off to the side and then we grab number 2. As for number 3, we can do that last because we can always slide it up from the bottom. So make sure you keep them separate, and once again, keep an eye out for the dot. So this one here has the dot facing the top, so that's going to be facing upwards. Okay, so this is where we just have to be very careful to make sure that we don't bend and snap the piston rings. So all we're going to do is just slide it directly over the top of the piston, and then we're going to get into the groove of number 2. You can get special tools for this, but if you are very careful and you've got a steady hand, you can do it manually. Like I said though, if you're unsure on how to do it, it is best to get someone else to do it. So this one moves correctly in the piston, and that's exactly what we want. Now wait until we go to install them before we then adjust the position of each of the piston rings. So now that we've done number 2, we're going to move back onto number 1. Once we've installed number 1, we'll move on to the oil scraper. Now these are what they call compression rings, and this is what keeps the compression within the cylinder. The final ring at the bottom is what we call the oil scraper. So as the conrod and the piston and the crankshaft is moving around down here, oil is being forced up into the bores of the cylinders. Some cars even have an oil squirter, which directs the oil directly up into the back of the piston to keep it cool, as well as to lubricate the cylinder wall. Now over time, it's going to collect oil. If there's nothing there to catch the oil can work its way past the piston rings and into the cylinder, which is a very unlikely case, but it does happen. So by having an oil scraper on there, it is going to be scraping it back down to the sump. That way it's going to minimize the amount of oil that travels up inside the cylinder itself. So we move these off to the side, that way we're not going to get them confused, and then we're going to go and open number 4. Now I'd imagine in one of these we'll have a spring, and then in the other one we're going to have a ring of steel. So that's our ring here, and this is what's going to give us the oil scraping. So that's going to separate the top and bottom ring of number 3. So now in the 4th one, we're going to have a different part altogether. Okay, so we have 2 lots of rings. So what we're going to be doing is applying a ring on the top of the oil scraper, so this spring ring here, and then we're going to be applying, if I can separate this, and then we're going to be applying a second ring on top of it, so it looks something like this. Once again, both of these piston rings, we want to ensure that we don't line up, so they're going to be in a different position. Now, so long as the piston ring that is above or below this is not anywhere near it, you will be fine. If you stagger them all roughly at the same sort of 6 and 12 o'clock or 2 and 10, that'll be fine. But it is best, the more rings you have, the more dials of the clock you want to offset the rings. So what we're going to be doing first is installing the ring. Now, I very believe that these are going to be a ring that needs to be directed to the top or to the bottom. So that will be fine. Now, we're going to slide it from the bottom. So we're just going to slide it over the skirt. The skirt is the bottom part of the piston, so this bit here. We're just going to slide it all the way down once it sits in the ring gap. Now we're going to grab our ring, slide it over the top, and then make sure she sits directly and snugly in here. So that's it, guys. Next episode we're going to be installing the pistons onto the conrods, and then installing the conrods onto the engine block. We're going to reassemble the cylinder head along with the new clutch, flywheel and pressure plate, followed by the timing chain. So until then, guys, as always, stay COVID safe.